Have you ever noticed how some of those stories in the book of Exodus seem pretty simple on the surface?
Like Sarah being taken by Pharaoh and then later by Abimelech.
Yeah, exactly. Like at first glance, they just seem like these little historical anecdotes.
Yeah.
But then when you really start digging into them, especially through the lens of Kabbalah,
Things get really interesting.
they do, don't they? There's so much depth and symbolism hidden in those narratives. And that's what we're going to dive into today.
We are. We're going to explore these seemingly straightforward events and uncover those layers of profound meaning.
Right. And see how they connect to the broader historical journey of the Jewish people.
And to the journey of each individual soul as it strives for spiritual growth.
So we're going to be looking at sources like the Zohar
And
and all those core Kabbalistic teachings to kind of guide us through this exploration.
It's going to be a fun ride.
It is. So to kick things off, I think the big question we're grappling with here is, are these figures like Pharaoh and Abimelech more than just historical rulers?
Right. Are they perhaps like archetypes representing these fundamental spiritual forces that are always at play both on the grand stage of history and also within each of us?
Exactly. So let's start with Pharaoh. What's the Kabbalistic take on him?
Well, in Kabbalah, Pharaoh isn't just seen as a king. He embodies this concept called Klippet Mitzrayim.
Klippet Mitzrayim.
Yeah, it's like the shell of Egypt, and it represents the state of spiritual constriction.
Constriction.
Yeah, like a real emphasis on materialism and a whole lot of arrogance. It's like being trapped in a tiny little space where your spirit can't expand.
Wow, so even his name, Pharaoh, there's got to be some deeper meaning tied to that.
Right, absolutely. The Kabbalists connect Pharaoh's name to the phrase Peirah, which means evil speech, or sometimes distorted perception.
So his very name kind of highlights that he's this force that's trapping and distorting the divine light.
Exactly, like his words and the way he sees the world are all clouded by this negativity.
In Egypt itself, Mitzrayim, that's more than just a geographical location, right?
It's way more than just a place on a map. The Hebrew word Mitzrayim is very closely connected to the word Mitzrayim.
And Mitzrayim means?
It means narrow places or limitations. So spiritually, Egypt represents all those things that hold us back from spiritual growth.
It's almost like those internal tight spaces that we all get stuck in sometimes.
Exactly.
It's really interesting how Sarah's being taken by Pharaoh almost foreshadows the entire Israelite nation ending up enslaved in Egypt.
Oh, that parallel is so important. It's like a mini version of this much larger spiritual journey. Sarah being taken by Pharaoh and then eventually being freed foreshadows what happens to the Shekinah,
The Shekinah.
the divine presence in the world. It also descends into the harshness of the Egyptian exile with the Israelites. And just like Sarah, the Shekinah is eventually redeemed.
So it's like this blueprint for the larger spiritual journey.
You got it.
Okay, so let's move on to Abimelech. Now, he's described as representing this more subtle impurity compared to Pharaoh. What does that mean?
Good question. It's an important distinction. While Pharaoh represents that overt spiritual enslavement through raw materialism and control,
Right.
Abimelech represents something a bit more insidious. It's spiritual confusion and this kind of blurring of moral boundaries. It's less about brute force and more about this subtle erosion of what's right and what's wrong.
And the Philistines, the people that Abimelech ruled, they're not just random folks in the story, are they?
No, they're not. In Jewish thought, the Philistines often represent this force that takes divine wisdom and twists it.
Oh, interesting.
So they use intellect and understanding for things like arrogance and manipulation instead of for good. It's almost like spiritual dishonesty,
Yeah.
misusing your gifts.
And his name, Abimelech. My father is king. What's the Kabbalistic insight there?
Well, it points to this false sense of authority, this idea that earthly rulers or our own little egos can actually control divine reality. It's a big no-no in Kabbalah. You can't just put something finite in the place of the infinite.
So Sarah being taken by Abimelech, it's not about physical chains or anything like that?
Right. It's way more about spiritual exile. Divine truth isn't being suppressed directly. It's more like it's being obscured and confused.
By things like moral relativism.
Exactly. Like in today's world where it's so hard to know what's truly sacred and what's not, that's the spiritual exile that Abimelech represents.
So we've got these two very distinct figures, Pharaoh and Abimelech, representing these very different types of spiritual challenges. Can you break it down for us one more time? Make sure we've got it.
Sure. Think of it this way. Pharaoh and Egypt. They symbolize that material enslavement, the physical oppression, that feeling of being totally constricted and without freedom. It's all about the klippa of constriction, that narrowness that comes from being too attached to the physical world.
Okay.
But Abimelech and the Philistines, They represent something else. It's that spiritual corruption, that intellectual and moral exile where the light of wisdom gets all twisted. It's the klippa of distorted wisdom.
So it's almost like they're using the tools of understanding to mislead people.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a really helpful distinction.
Yeah.
Now let's turn our attention to Sarah. She's obviously not just a passive character in this story.
Oh, absolutely not.
What does she symbolize in Kabbalah?
Sarah is a huge symbolic figure. She represents a few things, actually. First, she's the divine soul, or neshama. Then you've got the Shekinah, that indwelling divine presence in the world. And finally, she represents the essence of Nesa Israel, the community of Israel.
So everything she goes through, those experiences of being taken and then freed, it's all symbolic.
Exactly. Her journey reflects the journey of the Shekinah. Just like Sarah goes through exile and then redemption, the divine presence in the world goes through that same pattern, goes down into the world, and then it returns. It's like a divine dance.
And how does Sarah connect to the individual soul to our own personal neshama?
Think of it this way. We all go through times that feel like captivity, right? Times when we're challenged and we feel really disconnected from our spiritual source. Well, Sarah's story is reminding us that even in those tough times, our soul can still find redemption and liberation. It's like a message of hope. Even when we feel lost, there's always the possibility of return.
And the fact that she also embodies Israel, that just adds another layer of meaning to the whole thing.
Yeah, the Zohar actually talks about this in Parshat Licha 91a.
What does it say?
Well, it teaches that Sarah's two captivities by Pharaoh and Abimelech foreshadow the many exiles that the Jewish people have experienced throughout history.
So her personal liberation, it's like a promise of future redemption for the entire people.
It is. It's like this powerful archetype showing us that Israel will eventually be liberated from all forms of exile, both physical and spiritual.
This is all starting to come together in a really powerful way. So if Sarah's experiences mirror the historical exiles of the Jewish people, can we make those connections more explicit? Like, how do Pharaoh and Abimelech map onto specific periods in Jewish history?
Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. Sarah's captivity in Egypt under Pharaoh directly relates to the first major exile, the enslavement of the Israelites in Egypt.
Right.
It was a time of physical bondage and oppression, just like Pharaoh represents. It's all about material enslavement and the denial of basic freedoms.
And that's a literal narrow place, too.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And then you've got Abimelech and the Philistines.
Which exile do they connect to?
They relate to those later exiles like Babylon, Persia, and Rome.
Okay.
Those exiles weren't really about physical enslavement in the same way that Egypt was. It was more about an exile of wisdom.
Interesting.
It was a struggle to maintain spiritual identity amidst all these foreign influences and philosophies.
So it's like the challenge of holding on to your Jewish thought and practice when you're surrounded by Hellenistic philosophy or Roman culture.
Exactly.
And there's this idea of 4 major exiles in Kabbalistic thought.
Right.
Can we dive into those a little bit and see how they connect back to Sarah's story?
Of course. So Kabbalah identifies these 4 exiles that really parallel those challenges that Sarah faced. First, you've got the exile in Babylon, which is symbolized by Nebuchadnezzar and the destruction of the first temple.
Right.
This exile represents material destruction and loss. It's that shattering of the physical and spiritual center of the Jewish world.
That must have been a really tough time.
Oh, yeah. Then you've got the exile in Persia, which is linked to the story of Haman and Purim. This exile is all about spiritual corruption through pleasure and luxury. It's like being seduced by those things and losing your connection to the divine.
That makes sense.
Then there's the exile under Greece.
Right.
This one represents intellectual distortion. It's that time when human wisdom and philosophy try to overshadow divine truth. That's very similar to the distorted wisdom that Abimelech represents.
And finally, there's the exile under Rome.
The Western exile. This exile is associated with Edom, and it symbolizes moral and ethical confusion. It's a time when truth is being manipulated and ethical boundaries get all blurry.
So each of these exiles is like a different flavor of those challenges that Sarah faced with Pharaoh and Abimelech.
It is, and they all reflect this recurring pattern of exile and redemption throughout Jewish history. You've got divine wisdom, represented by Sarah, seemingly trapped by these negative forces.
Only to be liberated and restored in the end.
Exactly.
This brings us to a really important question.
Yeah.
What can we learn from all of this?
Right, like what are the takeaways for our own spiritual growth?
Because it's not just about history.
Right. Oh no, it's way more than that. One of the biggest lessons here is that exile is not just punishment. Whether it's happening on a historical level or a personal level, Kabbalah teaches that exile is actually a crucial part of spiritual refinement. It's like Sarah emerging from those periods of captivity stronger and wiser.
So we can actually grow from those challenging times.
Exactly. It's all about being tempered by those experiences.
And what about the idea of those lost sparks of divine energy?
Oh yeah. Rabbi Isaac Luria the Ari taught that one of the main purposes of exile is to give us opportunities to gather and elevate those lost sparks of divine light.
Which are hidden in all the messy stuff of life.
Exactly. It's like this cosmic treasure hunt. We're constantly reclaiming and reintegrating holiness back to its source.
And faith seems to play a really big role in Sarah's story.
Oh, it's essential. When Pharaoh and Abimelech tried to take Sarah, it was Abraham's unwavering faith and God's intervention that protected her. It's a powerful lesson for us. Even in our own personal exiles, the times when we feel lost and overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Faith acts as a shield, protecting our soul, our neshama, from being harmed.
So Sarah's journey is like a model for the journey of our own soul.
Absolutely. We all go through experiences that feel like exile, times of materialism and confusion and suffering. But Sarah's story shows us that the goal is redemption. It's about returning to a state of unity with divine wisdom. And the Messianic age, that's the ultimate liberation, the final return.
Let's talk a little bit more about the mystical side of this. The connection between Zerah and the Shekinah, the divine presence.
Oh, that's a deep one. The Zohar in Parshat Lech, Lection 93b, explains that Sarah's captivity isn't just a metaphor, it's a direct symbol of the Shekinah going into exile among the nations.
Wow.
It's like the divine itself is experiencing a kind of displacement during those times.
So when the Jewish people are in exile, the Shekinah goes with them.
It does. It doesn't abandon them. It goes with them as a form of protection and presence. It's a beautiful expression of the bond between the divine and humanity.
And that brings us back to the ultimate hope of redemption.
Yes, Kabbalah teaches that Sarah's return from captivity is directly tied to the Shekinah's return to its full glory. And that's what the redemption of Israel is all about. It's about restoring that divine unity and harmony.
It's the Messianic vision.
It is a time when faith and truth and wisdom are revealed to the whole world.
This has been an amazing deep dive. Can we wrap things up by summarizing the key takeaways for our listeners?
Of course. We've seen how Sarah's story, those two captivities, are a powerful foreshadowing of the exiles of the Jewish people.
Right.
Pharaoh and Abimelech represent these two very different forms of spiritual challenge. Pharaoh is all about that physical enslavement and the power of materialism, while Abimelech represents that spiritual deception and the distortion of wisdom.
And Sarah being freed from both of them.
It symbolizes the redemption of the Jewish people from exile, but also the redemption of divine wisdom itself.
And the return of the individual soul back to its source.
Exactly. And it reminds us that exile is not just punishment.
Yeah.
It's an opportunity for growth. It's all about elevating those sparks of holiness.
So the ultimate goal
is to restore that divine unity and harmony in the world through true faith, wisdom, and understanding.
Sarah's story might be ancient, but it's still so relevant today.
It really is.
It makes you think about all the challenges we face in our own lives and how they might actually be opportunities for spiritual growth and refinement. It's a really powerful idea. Thank you so much for taking us on this journey.
My pleasure. It was a lot of fun.
I learned a lot.
Me too.
Thanks again.
Anytime.